So thank you very much, Maximo and Ruth, for organizing this, and thank you for putting together that very nice set of briefs. It really is I think it's a real contribution. I've given myself the title here, Searching for a New Ending to the Same Old Story About Risk. And Ruth has already told us about the same old story. So increasingly aging people such as myself, and I wouldn't put Maximo in that category, but many of us have been writing papers for years on how risk really distorts behavior. And I think it's been important to think about that, but it's also obviously equally important to think about whether or not we can do something about that. And that's where I personally, and I think suspect all of us here, have become interested in wondering whether or not formal insurance contracts can play a role. And it's going to be tricky. And one thing we haven't really talked about, but I know all of us here have thought a lot about already, is what's the interaction that happens between formal insurance contracts and existing informal insurance mechanisms that are on the ground. So you don't want to destroy something in trying to create something better either. So there's a lot of complexity there. I think what I'm going to do is I'll try to get us to the movie fairly quickly because it'll say most of what I need to say, I think, more effectively. The main points I were going to make, and I'm not going to talk about this slide, but a way to think about the same old story is that missing and imperfect financial markets can make people poor. We've already talked about that a little bit. I would also argue that missing financial markets, lack of insurance and risk can keep people poor over time. And I'll say just a little tiny bit about this slide because it will help set up the discussion in a little more detail on the Kenya project. So this kind of ugly looking diagram in the middle of the page is what's called an asset recursion diagram. And it's based on real data, retrospective sort of panel data, and it shows us that there's sort of a tipping point in this system. And if people, this is a pastoral economy, and if people fall below a critical livestock threshold, which is around 10 sort of cow units, tropical livestock units as we call them, they have a tendency to collapse down to the bottom. And if they get above that level, they seem to be able to sustain over time an accumulation path. Okay, so if you think of that being out there, it has two incredibly important implications that are relevant to what we're talking about today. The implication number one is that if you can use an insurance mechanism to keep people from falling below that tipping point, that could have incredibly high social returns. So in this area of Kenya, which we'll look at in just a moment, the DFID, the British aid agency, has set up a cash transfer program basically targeted at the people who are at the bottom southwest corner of the graph, the people that have collapsed into pure indigency. Okay, and they're now doing cash transfers of $15 a month. And historically, the number of people in that eligible pool has been creeping up over time through the operation of these kinds of stochastic mechanisms, maybe climate change and other things as well. And in a sense, the appeal of insurance and the appeal we made to DFID is how much would you be willing to pay to keep that pool of people from growing? Because it's going to stretch out your aid budget. Your humanitarian budget. So these things are not different. So point number one is that in a system that has poverty traps, as we call them, in it, there's potentially extremely important role to be played for an insurance mechanism as a type of social protection, I guess you could say, or a type of social protection for the vulnerable. The other thing that comes out of thinking about this problem, especially if you think about it as an economist who thinks about, if you think in sort of an economic mindset about accumulation incentives, that kind of risk in a system actually discourages people in a very rational and understandable way. So should I sacrifice my consumption right now, make myself a little hungrier than I am right now in order to move ahead? Now, the calculus of that is if you're never going to get anywhere anyway because you live in a world where you constantly get knocked back down, then at some point you just settle in, and that's part of the economic logic, at least, that tends to sustain poverty traps. But if you put an insurance mechanism into that kind of logic, you actually begin to change the accumulation incentives. So in our own language, we've said, well, a hypothesis at least is that provision of strong insurance should actually crowd in private investment. It should begin to liberate it because you've really changed the incentives. You've improved the incentives for the sacrifice that is implied by accumulation. Will that work? We don't know. But that's what's there. So kind of the agenda, and Elena alluded to something called the I4. That's a spinoff, I guess we could say, of the BASIS Collaborative Research Support Program, which is funded by USAID. And the I4 is just this name of a partnership we're creating with researchers, with private sector people, government people, and NGOs to try to implement these kinds of projects. And the challenges are big. We've already talked about those a little bit. And I think what the I4 agenda is to really sort of build on what we've learned now. As the second sort of bullet point there at the bottom says, we're trying to relink with the development problems. And that's not just because we think that would make us feel better to relink with the development problem, but this is actually where we think the insurance can be most valuable, right, where the development problems are largest, and arguably that's where you might think uptake and impact would be the best. So we need to find ways to do that. So what I would like to do now is just jump to a little film that was just produced, a video that was produced by ILRI about an index insurance contract that was just launched in northern Kenya last Friday.
From remote arid areas of northern Kenya will be able to insure their livestock against the risks related to drought. ILRI, the International Livestock Research Institute, and partners faced huge challenges as they developed the new insurance policies. The region is large and underdeveloped. Most pastoralists have not heard of insurance. And no insurance company has ever found a way to insure small-scale livestock keepers in Africa before. ILRI researchers are using existing satellites to look at the condition of vegetation cover and so assess the state of animal feed. The new insurance policies do not pay out when animals die, but only when feed becomes very scarce.
In our game, one white sheep represents one cow, and one green sheep represents one sheep or goat.
Researchers have also produced an insurance simulation game to explain the key features of the complex product and tested it in communities across the Marsabit district. Results have shown that livestock insurance could be valuable even without the kind of drought that triggers payments. This new form of insurance will allow many herders to access credit for the first time, as well as cope with drought-related risks to their animals.
This is a concept that really can be scaled up and moved on beyond Marsabit into other pastoral areas of Kenya, into Uganda, into southern Ethiopia, in West Africa, in India, and so on. The prices might be different, but it's a promising concept.
Herders of northern Kenya, like many in East Africa, have just gone through the worst drought period in decades. New approaches, such as the insurance scheme, should help them escape chronic poverty in the future.
I think the film does a nice job of capturing the landscape. When it talks about large risk, we're looking at an area where families can lose 50% of their assets in a several-month period, and that happens, 5, 6, 7 year basis and smaller levels of risk. So it's really that notion that you can be shocked and fall all the way below tipping point is not just an imaginary kind of concept. The other thing I would mention is wasn't really captured in the film. To sort of get to this point, we sat down with the satellite data and we got all the micro data sets that we could assemble. And we did all sorts of statistical analyses. I won't bore you with the details, but basically trying to show that especially large mortality shocks experienced by individuals on the ground are highly predictable with satellite signals, and that wasn't ex ante obvious to any of us. And again, it wasn't trivial, but what I've sometimes called intelligent design of index insurance contracts is a call on ourselves, right? When we try to design contracts, let's get that kind of micro data and make sure that the insurance indices really track the livelihood kinds of indicators that we're actually trying to ensure. So we put a lot of effort in this project into designing, redesigning the contract. And as I say, it was launched last Friday. There was a tremendous amount of interest in Kenya. Several ministers from the government were there. All the MPs from that part of Kenya were there. As in many countries, insurance and risk in agriculture has been sort of a political football for a long, long time. And the fact that something was actually happening created a huge interest on the ground. This project's being rolled out with several partners. One is the Kenyan insurance company is called UAP Insurance. The actual sort of marketing agency is called Equity Bank. Some of you may be familiar with them. They're quite an active role. The way this is literally being implemented is with point-of-sale devices that can both work through cellular systems but also store information locally. And so people buy the contract through that. The good news I got in an email this morning from Andrew, whom we saw in the movie, is that the demand in this first week has actually overwhelmed the ability of Equity Bank to supply it. So Equity Bank has gone off on their own, and they're buying more point-of-sale devices, and they're also sending more people up there with sort of paper and pencil forms of insurance. So we'll see. It's an interesting question how it will work, how well it will be sustained. But I think it's generated the kind of excitement that it has in Kenya for a lot of good reasons. The final point, I'll make two final points, and one is just an obvious, perhaps, observation, but maybe one worth making anyway. And that is, I've worked in other projects where the idea is to insure income streams, and that's one kind of insurance. And it seems, at least if you think about it as an economist, or it seems like a very valuable kind of an insurance. This is different, right? This is asset insurance, and I think psychologically it's a little bit different because you're not trying to insure something people don't yet have, right? You're insuring something they have right in front of them. And I think in terms, we'll see, I mean, there's some behavioral ideas out there about why that might be different than insuring income streams. But it is something kind of interesting to think about, and the enthusiastic reception that we're seeing may have something to do with that. The final point I'll make, and I won't really go into this, but there's a research design around this. So we have these bold hypotheses, right, about breaking the slide downward into indigence, maybe improving accumulation amongst people who are sort of vulnerable. Well, we're actually going to test that out. So this slide here just represents basically a 2x2 experimental design that we have in place with a kind of standard research methodology. And we're actually, as I mentioned earlier, we're relaying this up against the cash transfer program. That's this thing called HSNP. And we're actually going to see, does the provision of insurance either by itself or in conjunction with a cash transfer program that's targeted at roughly the poorest 20-30% of the population, how do those things work in conjunction? And can we, as we come back every year over a 4, 5, 6 year period and we measure child health and we look at poverty rates and other things like that, what will we actually see as we offer this kind of opportunity? So again, I'm primarily a researcher. IFPRI is obviously primarily a research institute. But I think this kind of innovation is one thing, but then actually doing the work to see if it's a useful innovation is very much where we have to go.